Hello, world. You're listening to Eleanor Wagner's Strange and Scary World here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, where we're always creeping it real. I'm your host, Eleanor Wagner.
Although my books deal with the paranormal, I added in the other strange phenomena chapters because there is too wide a range of interesting topics that shouldn't go unnoticed. With that being said, today's guest is a perfect fit with a podcast of his own where he has interviewed dozens of near-death survivors, psychics, paranormal researchers, as well as quantum physicists and medical doctors. This best-selling author can keep us talking for hours. Please give a warm welcome to today's guest, Stephen Hawley Martin. Welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
I'm both thankful and excited to speak with you on a number of topics you're well-versed in. I'd like to start today with discussing your newest release, A Witch in the Family, which is a story you wrote about your direct descendant, Susanna North Martin, who was one of the women who was convicted and hanged for witchcraft during the Salem witch trials of 1692. I've started to read it and must admit I'm extremely intrigued. Back in the 90s, my husband and I took a trip to Salem to visit the site of the trials. It fascinated me then and fascinates me still to this day. I imagine it must have been difficult growing up with that stigma on yourself, and I've wondered how people in this type of situation handle people's questions, behavior, and reactions.
We didn't really ever think that Susanna was a witch, although when I started as an adult looking into it, I began to wonder, but then we can talk more about that later. But my parents were convinced that it was just a situation where she had been a very capable woman at a time when women weren't thought to be able to do much for themselves. She was in her 70s, and yet she ran a farm and was able to keep it going. Her kids had all grown. Her husband had died. And of course, people thought maybe she used witchcraft. Not maybe, they thought she used witchcraft to do it. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. We didn't really think that she was a witch, although I have run into people who gave me a strange look when I told them I had an ancestor who was one of the Salem witches, and, maybe they believed in witches. But no, it wasn't a problem growing up. In fact, I think it made me really more of who I am, in the sense that I don't necessarily believe what any person in authority says until I check it out myself and make sure they're right, because I know they can be wrong, and they often are. So there you go.
Well, it must run in your mother's genes, because reading your book so far, your mother seems to be a very strong, independent woman herself. And when she feels something about something, she is very strong on her points.
Well, she is. She was. My father died when I was young. I was only 7 years old, and she raised me and my sister. And my brother was already in college when father died. But she was able to do that back in the 1950s and send us both to good colleges. And if you read my book, you'll find out what I think really may be the case. But I'll leave that for people to read about.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if the accusation started in the southern colony where religion was less focused on in their everyday lives. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a good question. And one of the things that people need to understand is that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy chartered by King Charles I, and he allowed the Puritans to set up kind of almost like a country of their own, where it was a theocracy, so that what was in the Bible was law in their situation. Whereas in the South, where I grew up in Virginia, it was a totally different situation. There were a few witch things that went on here, but there was a law passed back in the 17th century that if you accused someone of witchcraft and couldn't prove it, you would be fined 1,500 pounds of tobacco, which was the equivalent of a year's crop for a small farmer. So you didn't go around accusing somebody of witchcraft lightly, because that was a pretty big fine if you couldn't prove it. So as far as I know, there were no convictions of witchcraft in the South, but up in the North, in New England, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there were the Salem witch trials were not the only witch trials. There were others that took place before that, and there were other executions that took place before that. Well, in Exodus, of course, that's where the Ten Commandments are given, and after those Ten Commandments, there are a bunch of little laws and rules that were also ditched out. I think over 600 of them, and one of them was that thou shalt not allow a witch to live. That's the King James version. So that's what they were going by. That was the law.
Right.
So there you go.
Well, thinking thinking about gender during the time frame of the Salem witch trials and which gender was more the accuser or the accused, how do you think this fits into the gender roles of the time?
Well, women were kind of second-class citizens, as they were all the way up until probably present days in a way. I mean, women didn't get the vote even later in some others. I think in France it was 1926. So women were thought of as the weaker sex, and that they were thought of as being more lustful, more likely to get upset about things, and they were really regarded as more likely to get in league with Satan. That he was a man, and he was dominant, and they would kind of gravitate toward that, and all kinds of ideas about what they might be doing with Satan. So women were more likely to be not only the accused, but the accusers. There was one man who was convicted of witchcraft in the Salem trials, and he was executed. And there was another man who they accused, but refused to plead, and they couldn't do anything unless he pleaded guilty or not guilty. And so they crushed him with rocks. They piled rocks on his chest, and his famous last words were, "More weight." And when they put that last stone on, his chest collapsed, and he was gone. But he was not convicted, but he was killed nonetheless because they thought he was a witch. But all the others were women, and most of the accusers, at least the original ones, the first ones, were females. Most of it began with the children, the girls in the parish household, which he was the preacher of Salem. And women were thought more likely to be witches, and they were more likely to be the ones who were victims of the witches, too. So there you go.
Interesting. Well, with what we know about adolescent children, what behaviors of the younger accusers do you think made the local clergy believe something was wrong with these children that seemed to be out of character?
Oh, gosh, they were, if you've ever seen the movie The Exorcist, I mean, it was as though they were being tormented by witches, and that's what they said, that the witches were coming to them as specters, ghosts, in other words. The spirit of the witch would come and torment them, and they had all kinds of physical characteristics. Their jaws, their tongues would come way out, and their jaws would open wide, and they would go have spasm. You need to read my book to find out what I think about all that.
I am working my way through it. I actually love the way you write. It's definitely keeping me right up there with page by page. I'm not much of an ebook person, so it's very difficult for me to read on the computer. So I'm working my way through that. I'm one of those traditional people that loves the book with the binding. I love the feel, the smell. So when somebody sends me a book via the computer, it's much harder for me to make my way through. So it's got to be good to keep me intrigued, and yours definitely is. And I will be finishing it to the end, as I will the other book that you sent me. So rest assured, I will be writing a review for it when I'm done. I'm enjoying it so far.
Oh, great. That's good.
The speed by which the trials took off is easily related to mob mentality. Can you define mob mentality and relate it to the Salem witch trial situation?
Mobs, I think, have developed what I think of as a group mind, where they're all kind of controlled by, it's like their minds merge. And one of my theories is, and it's not just my theory, but that all minds are connected. And the group mind, the mob mentality mind, becomes connected, and everybody gets caught up in it. And it's like lynchings in the South after the Civil War, things like that. People would just kind of go crazy. And I think to a certain extent that's what happened in the Massachusetts Bay Colony when the whole witch hysteria, that's what it's called, they were all hysteric. And they thought they were being besieged by Satan and his minions, who were the witches. They had a reason to kind of be upset in that they had been going through a pretty hard time with Indians attacking and that sort of thing. And they, of course, thought the Indians were also in league with Satan. They just got hysterical, and it went kind of crazy and pointing fingers, and it kept going for quite a long time, about 9 months. And once the trial started, I mean, it was like a steamroller rolling through the through the community. Yeah, it definitely was a mob mentality.
Was it difficult for you to track information on your own descendant when you were writing the book?
Not really. There's a huge amount of information that's out there. The University of Virginia has a website. I think it's one of the professors who teaches a class on this, has a website where all the documents are available, all the depositions that were taken before the trial, all the trial testimonies, lots of papers written by people who were eyewitnesses. There's a huge amount of information about the witch trials. And so, yeah, if anybody wants to do the research, it's all out there. And you can read it all in the original form. The language is a little bit difficult to tackle sometimes because the 16th, 17th century English is a little different than what we have now, and the words don't always mean exactly the same thing, but it's all there. It's no problem finding the information. So then that's where I got most of it, from that UVA website. I've been to Salem too, and been to the museum there and all that, but it's really convenient to get it all online,
Right. I'm sure that must have been fun when you actually discovered something that was related to you, not just a story. Like, oh my goodness, there it is.
A lot about Susanna in the historical records. She was quite a character. She did not actually live in Salem. She was from Amesbury, which is about 20 miles away from Salem, and she was known later as the Witch of Amesbury. There's a monument to her in that town, which you can find pictures of that on Google if you look for them. So yeah.
Now, what did the women who were accused of witchcraft have in common with one another, other than so-called witchcraft? And how is this relatable to today's people living within the margins of society?
Yeah, well, the first few women who were accused, were kind of the low end of the society. Sarah Good was the first one accused. She was kind of like the beggar, the homeless lady. I mean, she was married, but she was constantly looking for a handout, so she was an easy target for the accusers. And Sarah Osgood was on the next one, the second Sarah. She was also low on the totem pole of society. And then the third one, and the one who confessed, was Tituba. Tituba was a slave from Barbados. She was the slave of the parish household. The parish was for that was the preacher of the town, Puritan preacher. And Tituba had been entertaining the children, the girls who became the accusers, with what you might call our magic tricks or voodoo kind of things, where she would tell their fortunes. And one way that she did that was to drop egg white into a glass of water, and the children were supposed to look into that, kind of like a crystal ball, and they would see what their future husband's occupation was going to be somehow from whatever the egg white did. But she confessed to being a witch and to practicing witchcraft. I think perhaps because she realized that she was not a Christian, and she realized that if you confessed and promised to repent, that you would be let off. You wouldn't be executed. It may have been smart of her to do that. The others who were not witches would not confess because, of course, one of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not bear false witness, and that would send you straight to hell. So they remained true to their religion and did not confess falsely. But the first few were low status, a couple of beggars, a couple slaves. But then as it progressed, it started moving up the pecking order. And finally, I guess Rebecca Nurse was the first one to be accused who was actually a member of the church, which is kind of a status symbol. Not everybody got to be a member of the church. And everybody was shocked when that happened. And eventually it moved all the way up to the governor's wife. That's when there were over 150 people accused. Only 19 were executed. But
I was going to ask you what role a person's wealth had in helping or hindering accusations of witchcraft against them. In other words, was there an advantage in being wealthy? But it seems though it probably didn't really faze them. Kind of hit every angle.
Yeah, it started out being the lower people on the totem pole, but moved up. The Rebecca Nurse, nobody, her sisters, and she was from a well-to-do family, and she was like about the fourth, fifth one who was accused, and she was executed. But it was quite a while later when they finally got around to the wife of the governor, and that's when they called a halt to it. But I think they were going to anyway. There were so many people who believed that they were making a mistake, and people did come forward. The Baptist preacher told them that they should not include spectral evidence, which means the idea that somebody's ghost or spirit was coming and attacking them, because it could be Satan who taking that form. And in fact, the legend is that my ancestor, Susanna North Martin, she had already been executed by this time, appeared to the Governor Phelps and told him that his wife was going to be next if he didn't call a halt to things. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I think maybe just the fact that she was accused kind of pushed him over the edge to call a halt to the whole thing, which he did. And then people there were really later on in great remorse for what happened. They realized they'd made a big mistake and that a lot of people had been essentially murdered for no reason. I do think that at least one of the women who was accused and tried and convicted was probably, I don't know if she was a witch, but she was certainly using witchcraft. But only one that I could really find.
Are you referring to
No,
Tituba?
well, Tituba, no. Well, I guess Tituba was, yeah. But, I mean, she was doing harmless kind of stuff.
But back then,
what I would call white magic rather than black magic. Right. Whereas the, what's her name? Bishop, Rebecca Bishop. Anyway, they found effigy dolls in her house, in her basement. And so if there are effigy dolls there, she's doing black magic. And she was actually the first one, but probably the only one that was actually conducting witchcraft.
Effigy dolls are those ones that like they stick needles into and try to get a reaction out of the person who it's named for?
Exactly. An effigy doll was the effigy of someone that you wanted to injure. And yeah, they made them in a certain way. And I think they tried to get something from the person, like their hair or their fingernail clippings or something to put into the effigy doll. But yeah, they would stick pins in them or torture them. And supposedly that spilled over and did that to the person that the doll was an effigy of. And in fact, in the earlier witch trials that preceded the Salem witch trials, there was a woman who was obviously a practicing witch who used effigy dolls, and they brought them into the trial and handed one to her, and she started doing something with it with her hands, and one of the people in the trial courthouse actually started act like it was affecting them. I think up on the floor and writhing in pain. They definitely used effigy dolls.
Now, I know you mentioned earlier that the male that was executed for witchcraft was not stoned, but stones were laid on his chest until his chest crushed. What other types of punishments did witches receive?
The man who had the stones laid on his chest until his chest crushed was not actually convicted of witchcraft. They were trying to get a plea out of him. In order to proceed in a trial back then, and probably even today, you have to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. And he refused to do that. And so they couldn't try him until he pleaded one way or the other. And so to get him to give a plea, they laid him down and they started piling stones on him, big boulders, and say, okay, we'll let you up when you plead one way or the other. Well, he wouldn't do it. And then he was killed. Mm-hmm. The man who was actually executed had been a preacher in Salem some years before and was accused, and he was convicted and hanged. And by the way, the past tense of the verb to hang is hanged and not hung. Pictures are hung, people are hanged. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, one of the things that got people wondering whether or not they were doing the right thing, before they hanged him, he actually said the Lord's Prayer, and he forgave everyone who was about to hang him, which a witch was not supposed to be able to say the Lord's Prayer or any kind of prayer to God or Jesus. That was one of the things that got people wondering. But they executed him anyway, and he was the only man who was actually executed. You asked me about the other forms of punishment. They put people in stocks and things like that, but that was for smaller offenses. Witchcraft, you were hanged. In the Americas and in England, there was a law against burning witches that was part of the English law. On the continent, in France and Germany and Spain, they usually burned witches. And they burned them because they thought that if the body remained, that they might come back, I guess, kind of like zombies or something. Mm-hmm. So that's why they burned them. But not in England or in the Americas. They were hanged.
I see. I've always associated somebody being executed by witchcraft with burning with fire.
Yeah, like Joan of Arc. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's the way they did it on the continent.
Now, I think I know your answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think would have happened if Governor Phelps' wife hadn't been accused of witchcraft?
I think it would have ended eventually, pretty soon after about that time. The witch trials took place in June and July. I think the first hanging was in early July 10th, and then a bunch of them were hanged on July 19th. That's when my ancestor was. But she was accused, I think it was into the fall, maybe even October. And there had been about 150 people accused by then. And I think that enough people were starting to realize that they were making a mistake and were complaining to the governor. And to do that, you had to have a lot of nerve, because when people protested, they were then quickly accused of being witches themselves. Mm-hmm. So, and that was true of Rebecca Nurse's sisters, two sisters. But later on, they started to realize that they were making a mistake. And so I think that the governor's wife being accused may have been the last straw, but it was headed that way anyway. So it would have happened pretty soon after that.
I would think after 150 accusations, end. It should end sooner or later. My goodness. Definitely a mob mentality. Well, so your book, A Witch in the Family, is releasing soon. Why don't you tell us a little about when it's releasing, where somebody can actually find it?
Yeah, it'll be out by the time this podcast runs. Probably the easiest thing to do is to go on my website, shmartin.com, shmartin.com. And you'll see on my website, you'll see at the top where there's a menu, there's a button there that says books. And if you click that, it'll go to the page where all my books are. And it'll be on that page along with everything else I've written. And all you have to do is click on the cover image, and it'll take you to the page on Amazon where you can find out more about the book, maybe read the first chapter or two, and decide, whether you want to buy it. And maybe some of the other books I've written, like Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You'll Never Die, is one that I've probably my best-selling book now, because you find out that you are going to be around forever. So
yes, and we're going to be discussing that shortly. So A Witch in the Family, everybody should read it. Look for it. Well, you already know that I'm a paranormal investigator, and I write paranormal books. So my first book, Dream a Little Dream, is a fictional paranormal love story. My most recent books, the Sussex County Hauntings and Other Strange Phenomena series, parts 1 and 2, are nonfiction books about paranormal activity. I've personally experienced things and have stories of others around the county where I live in each of these books. Clearly, as a paranormal investigator, I agree there is evidence for life after death. I believe it comes in many forms, one being in the form of spirit. I'm a Christian, and I believe there is a heaven as well, and that our loved ones who have passed on have the ability to visit us. That we'd love for you to tell us your thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, well, I agree that there's a heaven. I prefer to call it a mental realm that we go to when we pass over. Most of us do. The spirits that haunt places, like you're talking about, are earthbound. Let me back up and say that we go to the place after we die where we feel comfortable. And as a Christian, you know that Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many rooms. And I've taken that to mean that there are practically an infinite number of places that you can go after death, depending on where you are in terms of your evolution, the evolution of your soul. And the people that tend to be earthbound and are haunting houses and things like that are probably either don't believe in a heaven or an afterlife, and they're kind of stuck here, or they don't realize that they've died. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And in fact, there's an outfit here in Virginia where I live, not far from here, that called the Monroe Institute, that you can go there for a weekend, and they've got a way of encouraging your spirit to leave your body and to have an out-of-body experience. And they actually have a group of people who go out when there's a disaster like 9/11 or a hurricane that kills a bunch of people, and they go to the souls that are leaving the bodies and help direct them to the light. Because the way to go when you leave your body is to look for the light and head for it. Well, some people don't see the light, and they stick around, either because they don't realize they're dead, or because they are not looking for it, or they're afraid to go because they're afraid they're going to be judged, or they're going to go to hell, or something like that. So let me tell you a story. I have a friend in France and in fact this story is in A Witch in the Family, in the book. His name is Henri, and he's a French count, and he inherited a castle to go along with his title and the grounds around it and the little village that it's part of. And when he inherited this castle, it's really more like a big manor house. It's not like a 12th century castle with turrets. It's like a great big house. And Henri done well in business and the stock market, and so he decided he would go ahead and fix up this place in order to have weekend. He lived in Paris, but he'd go there on the weekends. And when he was out there on weekends and the workmen were doing their renovations, he and his wife, when they would go to sleep at night, right before they dropped into slumber, he would hear, and she would too, someone like screaming for help. It was more of a mental kind of sound, but it was like something was going on that really bothered them. And after a while, he started looking around for what this could be, and he decided it was coming from the basement. And so he went down there and he saw a wall that looked a little newer than the others, and he got the workmen to come and rip the wall out. Well, behind the wall was a skeleton. And it had been there for who knows how long. Well, they took the skeleton out, gave it a Christian burial, and they never heard any more night noises. Well, what Henri thought probably had happened was somebody had knocked this guy in the head. They didn't like him very much. Knocked him on the head, put him there, bricked him up, and he came to, regained consciousness behind that wall and was screaming to get out. And he'd been probably screaming to get out for the last 60 years because he didn't know who was dead. But one of the things you need to know is that time, as we know it, does not exist in the mental realm of spirit or heaven or whatever you want to call it. It's a totally different experience. So it was like he was caught in a loop and probably thought he had just died for the whole time. It just happened. But anyway, that gives you an example of somebody who didn't realize that they were dead, and that can happen.
I deal with that all the time. I do. In fact, not too long ago, we were doing an investigation, my team members and I, in an old antique shop, and they had called us because they'd had a number of spirits in there, and they had gotten rid of quite a few, but there were some that just didn't want to leave. And you would kind of expect to find that kind of thing in an antique shop because they're bringing in old antiques and things are always attached to the things that they're bringing in. And if they're not really saging them, they're more likely to have more attachments. So we were going there to try and help them find out who was left over and maybe figure out if they wanted to leave or who they were, if they had a message and whatnot. And a couple of weeks prior to the investigation, a young man from high school had died tragically in a farming accident. And he showed up that night with my mediums and at this antique shop, confused, looking for somebody who could listen to him and help him. And I don't know, I guess somehow they know who can hear them and who can sense them because he was there. And we had this daunting task of telling this young man that he had passed on. It was horrible. But we were all women and we were all crying because it was like our own child. He was 14 or 15 years old when he passed. And here we were having to tell this young man, I'm so sorry, but you are no longer on this earth and we want to help you get to the light. So that's very similar to what you were saying, someone who just didn't know that they were dead. And
it definitely happens. It definitely happens because especially if it's something that, where they're killed quickly and they just don't know because they still are conscious.
Right.
They don't have a body and nobody can hear them, as you said. But I think as far as where most people go, I think that if they have time to realize that they're going to pass, and they do, that they're going to go to a place where they feel comfortable. What about a murderer? What about a Jeffrey Dahmer? Well, I think he's going to go to a place that you and I wouldn't want to be.
All right.
And you can call it hell if you want, but he'll be comfortable there because he'll be around people like himself. So as far as being a Christian goes, I'm a follower of Christ myself, and I think that Christ was an enlightened being and that his teachings are right straight on with what I believe. And I do think that he's been often misinterpreted, but as he said, in my Father's house, there are many rooms, and I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I'm sure that's what he did.
And I think there's a lot of people that would not see it in the same light, and I agree with you entirely, 100%. But there are some people that just see it in a one-way direction and don't see the other side of things and the possibility that those many rooms could mean many things. They just see it like one way, And going to your point about people when they're passing, they're kind of preparing themselves and they know where they're going and that they should be looking for that light. In interviewing people myself over the course of the last 2 years, I have interviewed people who have told me they've been with their loved ones before they passed on. And it's a really beautiful thing because 99% of the time those people are seeing and speaking to loved ones that have already passed on before them, and they're waiting for them to help deliver them to wherever it is that their next stage of life, I would think, is the best way to say it. My own father, when he was passing away, he came to me as well. And for him too, he was meeting all his deceased family members, and it was beautiful because before he met them, he was walking through a cloud of sadness, and all his emotions were sadness and anger and fear. And then once he met that first spirit of family, it was like a whole change emotionally. And then when she brought him into the midst of all the other family members, he was suddenly joyful and happy and forgot all his fears and anger that he had just moments before felt. So I think that also helps. I think they do wait for you and help you make that transition.
Yes, I've heard many stories like that. And I think that is a common thing for someone, a loved one, to come be ready for you to pass. And a lot of people see them before they actually pass. So they're kind of in and out of it on their deathbed, where they'll say, oh, well, Bobby's here, he's coming to get me. And, pretty soon after that, they pass and go off with Bobby to wherever and reunite, as you said, with loved ones that have gone on before. So that does definitely happen from everything I have read and found out and talked to people. people and so on.
So that brings me to the next part of a discussion I'd like to have with you about reincarnation, because it is just a totally different thing when you're thinking that you're going to die and go to, let's say, heaven. Can we believe in reincarnation or not? So my book, Sussex County Hauntings and Other Strange Phenomena, Part 3, which is due out in spring of 2022, will have an entire chapter in the Other Strange Phenomena section devoted to reincarnation. And I know you've done extensive research with respect to reincarnation and have evidence to support it. So I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I guess the most powerful evidence that I know of comes from the University of Virginia, from a division of the university called the Division of Perceptual Studies. And that was headed by a man named Ian Stevenson, who was a psychiatrist who graduated number one in his class from McGill University in Canada.
I've read a lot of stuff on him. I'm very familiar with him.
Well, he died in 2007, but he began investigating past lives back in the early 1960s. And this has been going on at the University of Virginia and still goes on today since the early 1960s. The man who took over for Ian Stevenson's name is Jim B. Tucker, and he is also a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed him twice. He's written 3 books on the subject. And of course, Ian Stevenson wrote something like 300 papers and about a dozen books. And he's got one book that's over 2,000 pages long about this. But children often remember their most recent past life. And they usually start talking about it when they're about 2 years old, when they learn to talk, anywhere from 18 months to 2 years old. And they usually continue until they're about 6. And one of the things and then they just kind of forget about it. But one of the things that the UVA study, they've got over 2,500 cases that they have investigated and studied, and it's in their computer files and so forth. And one of the things that most of these cases have, 70% of them, are children who remember a past life that was in some way cut short. For example, they might have been killed in the war, or they might have been killed in an automobile accident, or they might have been murdered. But for some reason or other, their life was cut short. And I think that's probably the reason they remember. And usually these children that have experienced that come back quickly. The average time between the death in the previous life and the birth in the current life is 15 months, which is, when you figure that 9 months, that is is the gestation period, then that's really quick. There are some that are much longer. One of the most interesting stories, I talk about it in one of my books, the one Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die, is the one of a young man named John Henninger, who recalled being a fighter pilot in World War II. His name was John Huston in that previous life, and he was shot down at Iwo Jima, at the Battle of Iwo Jima in the spring of 1945. He had a direct hit on his airplane, hit the engine with anti-aircraft fire, and he went down. And he started recalling that he was reborn in 1999. So that was a pretty long time. But he was able to remember the name of the ship, his friends, fellow pilots and others on the ship, kind of aircraft, all kinds of information that there's no way 2 or 3-year-old child could know or remember or have picked up from anywhere else. And in fact, his father took him to a reunion of the men on that ship when he was about 6 years old, and he recognized the men. He said, gosh, they're so old now, because they'd have been like 80s and 90s by that time. So yeah, I think that reincarnation is a fact. I think as a Christian, I will tell you that I believe that Jesus believed in reincarnation. One of the passages in the Bible that says that to me is when Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say I am? And his disciples said, well, some people think you're John the Baptist, but other people think you're Elijah or one of the prophets. Well, Elijah and the prophets, the last one was 400 years before Jesus was even born. So if he was Elijah or one of the prophets, he'd have had to have been reincarnated Elijah or one of the prophets.
Right.
And there are plenty of other passages too. I think that reincarnation is a reality, and it is part of the whole God's plan on our evolution of our souls, that we are born again and we come back to learn and to evolve. As you know, life is difficult, and it's difficult for a reason, because when we face problems and we overcome them, we grow. We face difficulties. We have things that are terrible as far as going through it is concerned, but once we've been through it, we realize that we have come out the other side a better person and more evolved person. And I think that's what reincarnation is. So that's what I think. Ask me something else about it.
I've always been fascinated with reincarnation. And personally, I have it could be an obsession with the Victorian era and the Titanic. And I still remember going to see the movie with my husband when it first came out. And I was traumatized. I was really, really traumatized by the movie. It was almost as if I had put myself back. And it was months before I actually got over it. And I kept on thinking to myself, there's got to be a reason why I'm so obsessed about it or so emotional about it. And I've always heard of people telling stories about their fear of water or one thing or another. And then I had a dream, which was so unusual and it was so vivid. I was in a car crash. It was 1950s. I could see myself perfectly. Then I could feel myself behind the wheel of the car. I knew exactly why I was there, how it happened. I watched it happen, and then I watched myself die. And that was the first time I'd ever had that happen before. And I said, it wasn't just a dream. Somehow I knew that it wasn't. So I made an appointment to go have a past life regression because I really wanted to see if I could find out anything about that particular dream. And of course, you end up finding out tons of other things you never even expected to, and other lives supposedly that I had. And in my head, after that past life regression, they're still in my head. I can still see those many past lives that I experienced during that session. And I came out of it thinking, was I really hypnotized or under or not? You almost feel like it's so unrealistic that you can't believe it, but it happened, if that makes sense to you. And I'm wondering, do you feel that past life regression is real, and is it effective?
Well, it certainly seems to be. I have not gone through that. I've had psychics tell me about past lives that I had, which seemed to ring true to me, but I've not gone through a past life regression myself, so I can't speak from personal experience, but I certainly have talked to others who have, and they are convinced that, that they had a past life and that they recalled it when they were under that hypnotism into that trance. So, yeah, I think it works. And there's a great book out. It's been out for a long time. I think it was published in 1988 by Brian Weiss, who's a psychiatrist, who was a secular guy who's Jewish in terms of his ethnicity, but he was not a religious person at all, who was working with a young woman who had a bunch of phobias and problems, and he was trying to regress her to childhood to find out when whatever it was the problem first occurred. And he told her to go back to the time when this problem first occurred, and she went back to a life 4,000 years ago and talked all about it. And then over a course of weeks and working with her in a number of sessions, she went through something like 30 incarnations where she had that same problem.
She was only getting it resolved now.
She finally got it resolved through this hypnotherapist, this helping her. And here was a guy who didn't even believe in reincarnation, but he kept working with her because it seemed to help. And it did. She was eventually cured. The name of that book is Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. And it's the case history that I just mentioned.
Somebody recommended it to me. I've got to get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if reincarnation is real, how is it that the population is so much larger now than it was in the past, with so many people on the planet today than ever before?
Well, because I can tell you from what I've been, just from my research, there are many, 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 many more souls out there now than there are incarnated on Earth right now. There's 7 or 8 billion people on Earth. There's plenty more souls in the universe than that. And the Earth is just one place where there's life and where there's people incarnating. That's really not an issue. Plus, apparently, a lot of people would like to incarnate and can't. They're waiting their turn. So it's not like that there's more people alive than there are souls to go around. It's the other way around. There are more souls to go around than there are people.
Interesting. I know there's a misconception too that past lifetimes for everyone were maybe famous ones. You hear about it often. Oh, I was so and so in my past.
Was Cleopatra, or St. Paul or something.
And how is it that some people, young children, say lose whatever memories they had at 6, but then there are others that keep them into adulthood? Like I have a personal friend who's on my team. He's a team member of mine, Art Peterson. He remembers who he was before and actually got a name too. it. He found out who he was over the course of his lifetime. How is it that they remembered? Is it because parents instill that understanding and are agreeable to having the children learn more about those things, or where another family might be mum on the whole thing and not believe in it, so they would shut them down when they start talking about it?
I think that happens. I think that often happens where a child starts talking about a past life and parents say, oh, you're dreaming, that's not possible, we only live once, blah, blah, blah. And it shuts the kid down and they eventually forget about it. Whereas if in countries where, like India, where they just take it for granted, it's much more prevalent. People remembering their past lives.
I'm sorry, in India? In India, it's yes.
India. Buddhists, Hindus, part of their religion, reincarnation is a fact. And so they don't squash it. And because of that, they have more people remembering. And I have a friend who has recalled something like, and he's made a list of them, he sent it to me the other day, of something like 30 incarnations that he recalls, at least parts of. And, I have another friend who spontaneously has remembered different ones, and, now still remembers. They just, something like it.
They've been able to trace back to who they were, actually get names and stuff like that. I find that very interesting when people can.
Well, this particular guy, I don't know that he's done that, but it's like he's in a city that he's never been in before, and then he sees a building, a church or whatever, and suddenly the memory comes back. It triggers the memory of previous life. In his case, he remembered he was taking a train from Warsaw to Auschwitz and recalled when he was on a train taken to Auschwitz to be executed.
Oh.
And he remembers the whole thing from going into the shower room and having the poison gas come through the shower heads and leaving his body. And he says that he actually helped a lot of the people who were killed with him find the light, because he's a pretty advanced soul himself. And it's interesting. When I've had a podcast and interviewed a lot of people, and that was one of them. And he's actually not just somebody I met on my podcast, but I know him as a friend. He's a lawyer that was my lawyer and confided in me about it. It's not something he talks about to a lot of people because they think he's crazy if he does.
Oh, interesting. Oh, my goodness. I found in the cases that I've been interviewing people, when they do find out who they were, when they can connect themselves to a name, actually, and if it's in a time frame where there are photos and they could find a photo, in most cases, you'll compare a photo from who they were to a photo of who they are now, and the similarities are just unmistakable.
Yes.
Like you can see that they are one and the same.
Yes, absolutely. That's the case, for example, I talked about recall down in World War II. You can probably go online and find a picture of John Huston and a picture of who he is now, Leninger, or whatever his last, John Leninger, and side by side, and they really look like the same person.
Isn't that amazing? Oh, I just love that. I think, so when I used to work in the city, before I was married, I was an administrative assistant, so I worked in New York in several areas of the city. Sometimes I was in Midtown, other times I was downtown. But no matter where I was, if I was out and about at lunchtime, say, or doing shopping, hordes of people all over the place. I mean, you'd be walking in the midst of mobs throughout the day, and so often, pretty much every single time I was out, I would look at faces and say, my goodness, I know that person. Where do I know that person from? But it would happen for so many people. I can understand if it was just a random person and go, I know that person from somewhere. But to be so familiar with so many faces, to me, was not a coincidence. So my question to you is, do we meet people from our past lives? Do they become a part of our present lives in one way, shape, or form?
Well, I think so, absolutely. And one of the theories is that we are each typically part of a soul group of up to around 30 or so other individuals who often will, we're evolving together. I mean, the whole purpose of reincarnation and of life on Earth is to evolve. Evolution is the goal. We're evolving toward reuniting with the source, with God. And that we're part of a group of about 30 souls who are together doing that. And we will incarnate, many of us, not all 30, but many of us will incarnate together so that we will be someone who is your husband in this life might have been your brother in a past life, or someone who is your daughter in this life could have been your wife in a previous life. So that friends that you have, that you meet, it's all kind of planned out.
You just made me laugh because my daughter, my eldest daughter, insists that she was my mother in another life. A psychic told her that. And I'm saying she's 26 years old now, and she's convinced that she was my mom in another life. It can be very difficult at times because she wants to reprimand me, talking to me like I'm her child and not her mother.
Yeah, I think we do. We plan our lives out. We often don't execute the plan well because we do go through this veil of forgetting. Part of the deal is you have to forget who you were. Not everybody does, obviously. There are children who remember, but most people don't remember, and there's a reason for it. It's because you're often here to overcome karma. And if you know why you're here and the karma you're supposed to overcome, then it's like cheating, like knowing the answer to the test before you get the test because you looked in the back of the book or something. It's an open book test. It's not fair. So that's why we go through the forgetting process, so that we can meet these challenges and obstacles fresh each time. There's a movie, Groundhog Day. I'm sure you've probably seen it.
Uh-huh.
To me, is the perfect allegory of what life is all about. Bill Murray's character starts out as a jerk and his very low awareness of what's going on. And as the movie progresses and he goes through Groundhog Day after Groundhog Day after Groundhog Day, and he meets the same situations each time, he finally gets it and does the right thing. And that's when he gets to move on to February 3rd. And that's, to me, what life is, these incarnations. The woman in Brian Weiss's book, Many Lives, Many Masters, she had 30 opportunities to move on till she finally made it in this. So, yeah, that's what it's about.
How does one account for hereditary traits and tendencies?
Well, I think...
Why is a person reincarnated into a certain body?
Well, I think that if the people who say that you plan your life out, or even though you may not execute it well before you're born, you've chose the body because there were certain lessons that having that particular kind of body or those problems that come with it are going to create a situation where you can learn whatever it is you're here to learn. I think about, people who have deformities and things, and, that's terrible. I mean, it's a terrible situation, but they probably chose that in order to experience whatever it is that they needed to experience in this life, because this lifetime is just one of many. So I think that probably answers. When you're on the other side looking at what you're going to experience, you don't perhaps realize how difficult it really is going to be when you get here. But,
true. How exactly does the soul transmigrate from one body into another?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. Different things that I've read and people have told me is that a soul can enter the body of a fetus. Doesn't have to be at the moment of conception. It can be later on in the pregnancy. But that's when it happens. It's usually before the actual birth of the person. And they can kind of go back and forth, apparently, during pregnancy. But it's sometime between the conception and the actual birth is when it enters. And it comes from the mental realm, the heaven we talked about, the place where whatever level that person is on. And as I said earlier, I think you go to the level that you feel comfortable. And you certainly go to the level where your other soul group is located. And that's from there that you look down and decide what you're going to do. And, the boy who remembered being a fighter pilot in World War II once told his father, I believe, that he chose them, his father and his mother, because he thought they looked like they would be good parents, and that he saw them when they were at the Pink Hotel near the beach in Hawaii. And in fact, that is where they conceived that child.
Their relationship was probably consummated and he was conceived, right?
Exactly.
And you mentioned earlier karma. I'm a firm believer in karma, and I truly believe in its power. Can you explain karma and its purpose for the listening audience, please?
Yeah, people think of karma as action and reaction. You do something bad comes back to you. But it's really not that simple. I mean, that's part of it. But karma is, I think it was Edgar Cayce who said it's like a kind of memory. It's kind of who you are, and what you need to change is embodied in that. And let me give you an example. We all know people who attract to themselves and get into a relationship with someone who doesn't treat them well, who either abuses them psychologically or even physically. And that'll be the case. And then when they finally split up with that person, they'll find find another individual that they'll form a relationship with, and the same thing will happen, where that person will abuse them. And one relationship after another is like that. Well, that person will think to themselves, it must be my karma. And it is their karma. But the thing of it is, they probably have a low opinion of themselves, and they keep attracting to themselves someone with the same low opinion that they have. And the way they overcome that karma is by realizing that they're much better than that, and they don't have to attract that kind of person. They're a spiritual being having a physical experience, and they're an eternal being. They're a human being. They're at the top of the food chain, and they're really pretty special. And once that realization comes to them, and that's how they feel about themselves, they will stop attracting that kind of a person to themselves, and they will have overcome that karma. So, you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. Now, if someone's intention is good, let's say, but they react with a bad action, nonetheless, will bad karma follow them?
Well, I think I would restate that to say if their intention was good and they did something based on that good intention, but it turned out badly, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, no, they're not going to suffer because of it. But if they knew the difference between doing the right thing and they did the wrong thing anyway, then yeah, I think it's come back to them.
Right. I see that. I can understand. Now, how does one rid themselves of negative karma? I know what you're going to say, change that moral compass and do the right thing, but if you've already got negative karma on you, how to get rid of it?
Well, again, Edgar Cayce, I don't know if you know him, but he was the sleeping prophet, the 20th century's probably most famous psychic, had a lot of these kind of questions come to him. And it's not a bank account. You do good work, you're going to get good work back, and you got to balance out the equation. It's changing the basic law of metaphysics is like attracts like. A person who has a low opinion of themselves is going to attract a person with a low opinion of them. And that really explains the law of karma. I mean, you've, I'm sure, heard of the law of attraction. Like attracts like is the basic reason that we attract who we are and what we are inside. So the way you overcome karma is by changing who you are and how you think and what you think. Just taking the action doesn't do it. It's like in Christianity, good works aren't going to get you into heaven. It's your beliefs and your faith and so on and so forth that get you into heaven. It's changing who you are and what you are that gets you into heaven. And that's what changes karma. So as long as you don't change what's causing you to meet those situations time after time, you will continue to meet those situations time after time. Once you change yourself, then you're not going to attract that to yourself again. Do you see what I mean? Am I making any sense?
Yeah, it is. But can bodily diseases and disorders be linked to karma as well? I know that you had said if somebody has a disability of some sort, that they possibly chose that life for themselves, and I get that. But other things different than that, other bodily diseases or disorders, can they be linked to karma?
Well, it is in a way, because I think that there's really that all health and issues to do with health are psychosomatic. I mean, that's not to say that you don't really have COVID if you got it, but...
Do you mean to say like the power of positive thinking, and if someone's glass is half full and another's glass is half empty, that has an effect?
I think that here's what Edgar Cayce said about this. I'll apply what he said to this. Spirit is the life, mind is the builder, the physical is the result. What spirit is the life, that's the life force. Mind is the builder, it creates something, a thought form. The physical is the result. So if you're being sick or getting sick, or think that if you sit in a draft you're going to get a cold, you're going to get a cold because you have brought it on yourself. Now, a draft does not cause a cold. A cold is a virus, but your body will let that virus in because you believed it was going to happen. So yes, it's the power of thought. It's the power of belief. People who worry constantly, they're hypochondriac type people about this problem or that problem, are the people who have this problem and that problem. They bring it on themselves.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. All right, so here's another question for you. Does the karma of our parents and ancestors affect our own karma? Can we be punished or cursed by their bad karma?
Yeah, well, there's a Bible verse out about the sins of the fathers
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the way I interpret that is that if your parents bring you up in a way and teach you as you're being brought up certain things that are not good for you or good for producing good results, yeah, because you had those parents and that's what you learned in the environment you had growing up, yeah, you're going to bring those sins of your father on you. But that doesn't mean that you can't overcome them, that you can't realize that maybe you ought to change how you're thinking, that maybe your parents' ideas about things weren't correct. And so that is the way you would overcome that karma. But it's not because your parents were a certain way. It's because they molded you in a certain, you can unmold yourself.
Getting back to that point about power positive thinking, if you have a parent that says, our family is cursed, and they've brought you up your entire life that you were cursed by something that happened, a family feud or whatever, you're going to have that in your head, and you might grow up thinking about it and believe it so much that it is so.
Exactly. Or they might say, gosh, people in our family have a fat gene. We look at a donut and it goes straight to our hips. Well, those people, look at the family. They're all fat. It's because they believe it's going to happen. And it's, self-fulfilling.
Very true. On another note, is a person destined to suffer in one incarnation because of a bad action that they committed in a previous incarnation, even though they have no recollection of it? Like, I'm convinced that there are people that did something so horrible in their previous life that they are, I don't want to say suffering for it, but definitely dealing with difficulties in this life because they've got to make up for their bad actions. But I don't know how you feel about that. So that's why I'm asking.
Well, again, it's like what I said before. It's a matter of changing who you are, changing your beliefs. But take, for example, suppose you were a racist and you hate black people or vice versa. You might come back as a black person just so you can experience what that's like.
Yeah.
And having prejudice against you. So, yeah, maybe in that sense, perhaps it's true. But I don't think that you come back to get punished just to be punished. I think you come back to learn a lesson.
A lesson. Mm-hmm. Now, is it true that God created the law of karma?
No, God created all the laws, all the metaphysical laws and the physical laws. And there are metaphysical laws. I'm a Rosicrucian. I'm a Rosicrucian adept, and that we study metaphysics and metaphysical laws. And as I said, the basic law of metaphysics is like attracts like. And that leads to all kinds of things that spin off of that, including the law of attraction, karma, and everything else. So yeah, God created it.
Oh my goodness, such an interesting topic. Well, we'll change our direction now. When writing my first Sussex County Hauntings book, one of the main reasons for adding the chapter in the other strange phenomena category was that because so many people reached out to me with personal accounts of their experiences with unidentified flying objects. What do you think UFOs are, and why are they visiting us?
Good question. I think that from what I've seen, of the pictures of UFOs and so forth that you see on TV now, and my first boss, I guess, out of college, had been a pilot in the Air Force. And he and I were having a drink after work one day, and he told me that he was flying a big transport plane, Air Force transport plane, across the Atlantic going to Germany. And a UFO, glowing orb, came up beside the cockpit. And everybody, and I think there were 7 other people on the plane, everybody saw it. It rode along beside them for a half an hour. And then it just shot off to the right in a way that normal aircraft would never be able to do. And he said that he wrote that up in a report, filed it with his superior officer, however that's done, and he never heard any more about it. Well, I'm convinced that UFOs do exist. We've all seen pictures of them on television. And what I think they are, Frank, is they are representatives of a higher, more advanced civilizations that are not located in physical reality, in 3-dimensional, 4 dimensions if you count time, reality. They are, and I think that we eventually, as we evolve, will also inhabit non-physical realities, mental realities. I think that we're now in what's called 3rd density. We're moving into the 4th density. But when we get into the 5th density, we won't even be in a physical reality. And that's where most of, not all probably, but most of these UFOs come from. And they can come into our reality and check us out. They can even go under the water or over the water or whatever, because they're not really physical. And then they leave. And I think the reason they're coming is to check us out and see where we stand. And they're kind of waiting and hovering around to see if when we're going to be ready to be contacted and be brought into this society of more advanced beings. But we got a ways to go. So that's kind of what I think they are, at least most of them. So what do you think?
I do believe that there are beings from other planets. I mean, God created us. It can't just be us. I've had my my own experiences with things I've seen, so I can't just poo-poo them as not having happened. So I do agree that they are higher beings with much more intelligence than us, and I do believe that they come down to see us, oversee us, maybe learn about us. I don't think it's just one group of...
No, it's different civilizations.
But this next question that I'm going to ask you, though, is extremely unusual. You're probably going to wonder, wow, where did she come up with this? And I'll explain why. Do you have any comment as to the theory that Bigfoot may be an alien? And the reason why I'm asking that is because one of the interviews that I had for my book, there was a connection. I'm going to refer to a UFO crash that took place in Lake Owassa in the western area of Sussex County where I live in July of 1963, which coincided with the first Bigfoot sightings in the area. This woman, Nancy Bradley's uncle Arnold, went to his grave still fighting to get the story exposed. This alien craft crashed in their lake. The next thing you knew, the government was coming in and they were taking the thing out. They were covering it up. They talked to the family about shushing everything. And the uncle didn't like that. At the time, he was young, obviously, but he did not like that they wanted to keep them quiet about it. And so, as I mentioned, he went to his grave trying to reveal it to the world. And when I spoke to Nancy, she wanted to share his story and tell what happened. And shortly thereafter, the county started having all of these sightings of these Bigfoot creatures. And so the next thing you knew, people were saying they came out of that craft that crashed. So what do you think about that?
Well, I suppose anything's possible. I have not heard that kind of a story before, but I suppose it's possible. I've always kind of thought Bigfoot was maybe like Neanderthals or something who just sort of went off into the woods and into hiding. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I really don't. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, if I believe in unidentified flying objects, I can't put the notion that there isn't a possibility that this Bigfoot exists, especially since it's probably one of the largest chapters in my first book that I had no intention of even putting there. But when these people were coming out of the woodwork with their stories and with photographs and footprint evidence, it was undeniable. And I said, well, I'm going to have to put the chapter in there. So I've always believed the possibility of its existence, and there you have it. I believe that there is a possibility that it does exist, and what it is, I have no idea. I was fascinated by the idea that it might have been an alien that came down in that craft, but they're sighted all over the country, all over the world in different ways, shapes, or forms. And so I don't know exactly what they are, but I do believe that they possibly exist.
Yeah, I think they possibly exist. Whether they're on that aircraft that crashed, that UFO that crashed, I don't know. I mean, like you said, they're in the northwest of the United States. They're in Himalayas. I mean, wherever.
I think they have different names and titles for them, but they're all similar in nature. There's the Yeti and there's Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and they're all supposedly of the same structure and type. So
if they do exist in that way, if they're not aliens from another planet, it seems to me there would be something like as I said, a Neanderthal or some other species that kind of is very timid and wants, obviously,
right.
Neanderthals inhabited Europe before we got there, and we pushed them out of there, and maybe that's where they went.
Well, that's true, but how do we know they aren't an alien, let's say, that their planet became uninhabitable, and so they were dropping them off here to live, but one of them crashed on that particular night in the 60s, 1963.
Maybe.
You never know, right?
You never know.
Earth was a place that they could actually survive, so they've kept to themselves and hidden, and they do procreate, because I do have stories of people that heard and saw families of them. Yeah, and, these people that I've interviewed, too, I mean, it could just be my neighbor, but they're doctors, teachers, police officers. So I can't call them crazy either, because I feel like I'm talking to just an ordinary person like you and I, but they have these interesting backgrounds, and they're telling me this happened to them. It must have happened.
Yep, could be.
So life every day is very interesting. I love learning and hearing more. I love meeting people, and I'm very thankful for you giving me your time and talking to me today, Stephen, and for sharing your stories and your background with the rest of the world. And to you, the public, you can follow Stephen and find out more about his upcoming work and events at his website, www.shmartin.com. That's shmartin.com. Correct?
That's correct. Thank you so much.
Would you like to add anything before we say our goodbyes?
Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking with you, and I hope people will visit my website and take a look at my books and my blog and that sort of stuff. That you and I can do this again sometime.
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
And thank you, paranormal enthusiasts, for tuning in today. I hope you'll come back again. Remember to tap into your own gifts. Everyone has them. And in the meantime, make sure you're creeping it real.